Episode 4. Nothing, Fawcett put in, rubbing eyes that were now red to the lids. Nothing, Omicron whimpered. Then it started to cloud over again. As far as the sky was concerned, and the whole day as well, that was that. The cloud cover was soon a filthy grey mass, then it started to drizzle. To their utter despair, Fawcett and his assistant had to give up any further attempts at sky watching. Then Omicron said, "But sir, aren't we positive we saw it?" "How could we be more positive?" Fawcett exclaimed, raising his hands to high heaven. Then in a tone that was equal parts worry and jealousy, he added, "I only hope Stanley Huddleston didn't see it too." Chapter 3, whose subject is Dr. Stanley Huddleston, his wife, Mrs. Flora Huddleston, and his two daughters, Miss Jenny and Miss Lou. And likewise Dr. Stanley Huddleston was saying to himself, if only Dean Fawcett didn't see it too. He was a physician, though he didn't practice medicine in Boston. Instead, he chose to devote all his time and talent to the exalted discipline of astronomy. In any case, Dr. Huddleston was well off, with both his own money and the dowry of his wife, Mrs. Flora Huddleston, née Clarish. Well, I think I must say née is like a French word, like born into the name Clarish. Thanks to his shrewd handling of this fortune, his future was secure, and so were his two daughters, Jenny and Lou. This stargazing doctor was 47 years old, his wife 40, his elder daughter 18, and his younger 14. The Huddlestons were old friends of the Fawcetts, yet there was a definite rivalry between the doctor and Francis's uncle. It wasn't just that they argued about various stars and planets, since what's out in space belongs to everybody, even those who weren't its original discoverers, but they often wrangled over various atmospheric phenomena they'd observed. The only thing that made things worse and led to moments of real nastiness had been the presence of Mrs. Fawcett. As we've already seen, no such lady existed. Fawcett was a bachelor, and he'd never had any thoughts of marriage, not in his wildest dreams. Since he didn't have a wife to rush to his defense and complicate matters, there was every likelihood that squabbles between the two amateur astronomers could be patched up quickly. True, in the second family there was still Miss Flora Huddleston, but as a woman, mother, and housewife, she was the soul of good-natured sweetness, incapable of being at odds with anybody, and never given to gossip or backbiting, unlike many otherwise reputable ladies in America and Europe. She was a model partner, and her specialty was calming her husband down when he came home in a huff after some shouting match with his old pal Fawcett. Mrs. Huddleston, should be noted, was completely accepting of Dr. Huddleston's obsession with astronomy. She didn't mind if he spent his whole life in outer space, so long as he came back down to earth when she asked him to. But unlike old Mrs. Mitz, who brutalized her master, she put up with her husband's foibles, waiting for him at mealtime or on social occasions. She never scolded him and even managed to keep his food warm. She tolerated her absent-mindedness when he was caught up in his work. She worried about it along with him, and she knew when to dole out words of encouragement if he seemed bothered by some discovery and was literally lost in space. Everybody should have such a wife, not just astronomers. Their elder daughter, the lovely Jenny, gave promise of following her mother's footsteps, of taking the same path through life. If Francis Gordon married Jenny Huddleston, he had a decent shot to be becoming the happiest man. Without slighting other American girls, we can honestly say you won't find a more attractive, charming, and gifted young lady anywhere in the United States. She was a sweet-natured, blue-eyed, clear-skinned blonde with delicate hands, dainty feet, and a lovely figure, unassuming elegance and godness as well as good sense. Sorry, and goodness as well as good sense. So Francis adored her as much as she adored him. Besides, Fawcett's nephew was both a friend and a favorite of the Huddlestons. Um, all of which had soon evolved into a proposal of marriage, an offer that was wholeheartedly accepted. The two young people were genuinely compatible. Jenny's domestic talents would create a comfortable home. Francis would provide financial security since he was due to take over his uncle's fortune someday. But we don't need to bother with these inheritance prospects. It wasn't just that their future was secure. Their current circumstance already had all the ingredients for happiness. So Francis Gordon had become Jenny Huddleston's fiancée, and vice versa. The wedding was supposed to take place in the near future. Father O'Garth presiding at St. Andrew's, the biggest church in that blissful town of Austin. And the nuptials, rest assured, would be well attended because both families were held in the highest regard. You can also rest assured that the happiest, liveliest, and least inhibited individual that day would be the maid of honor, Jenny's baby sister, darling little Lou. This young lady hadn't quite turned 15, so she could get away with anything. She was everybody's favorite, everybody's pampered pet. Lou had a trait that the personality experts say is standard for her type. She couldn't hold still for a second. She was a mischief maker, a sassy little thing who even dared to joke about Dad's planets. But nobody cared. Everybody forgave her. Dr. Huddleston was the first one to chuckle, and the only punishment he administered was a kiss on her teenage cheek. Deep down, Dr. Huddleston was a decent fellow, but he was also bull-headed and temperamental. Aside from Lou, whose kidding was shrugged off, everybody else held his facts and eccentricities in awe. Addicted to sky-watching, consumed by his quest for new phenomena, jealously guarding the discoveries he made or claimed he made, he viewed his friend Dean Forsyth as a competitor, and got into endless feuds with him over this or that meteor. They were two hunters out in the same meadows, arguing about who shot what. Many a time, clouds gathered and storms were on the horizon, but gentle Mrs. Huddleston usually managed to brighten up the skies, and she was capably assisted by her two daughters and Francis Gordon, because once the wedding of Francis and Jenny had brought the two families even closer together, the occasional storms would be less of a problem. And who knows, maybe the two hobbyists would team up and carry out their cosmic research as partners. After the day of hunting together in the vast reaches of outer space, maybe they would be willing to divvy up the spoils. We can't resist mentioning that while he was studying this case, Dr. Stanley Huddleston was also deeply interested in statistics, especially the branch of statistics that measures crime rates whose fluctuations, according to authorities in the field, coincide with changes in the temperature and weather. Dr. Huddleston put great energy into diagramming those correlations on a graph. He did everything he could to keep up his crime chart up to standard. He shared his personal. It's really interesting because that chart sounds a lot like keeping an Excel chart to trade crypto. He shared his personal insight in a regular correspondence with Mr. Linois, Director of Weather Services for the State of Illinois, and there was no contradicting him when backed by the experts in the doctor would allege the crime rates go hand in hand with look, and there was no contradicting him when backed by the experts in Chicago, the doctor would allege the crime rates go hand in hand with rising temperature, if not on a daily basis, then at least a monthly or seasonal basis. According to this view of things, there would be a slight surge in criminal activity during fair weather and a slight decline during foul weather. The cooler the temperature, typical of winter months, and the heavy rains characteristic of springtime seem to correspond to a decrease in crime against person and property. What's more, the numbers positively plummet when the winds shift to the northeast. Finally, it seemed that the three graphic curves charting insanity, suicide, and crime overlapped each other pretty closely under the same seasonal and temperature conditions. Yes, Dr. Huddleston was completely sold on these interesting theories. Consequently, to cope with criminal activity and the danger of being victimized by it, he advised taking the greatest precautions during those months and when it was criminally hot. So Lou smirked, and that she would lock herself in. Oh, look at me, read my lips. So Lou smirked that she would lock herself in whenever it got warm, whenever it got dry, and whenever the wind blew the wrong way. Dr. Huddleston's home was as well kept and comfortable as any in Boston. Located halfway down Morris Street at number 27, this lovely mansion was a landmark. Its front yard and back garden adorned with leafy trees and green lawns. It was a two-story home with 7 windows in front. Towering over the left side of it, towering over the left side of its peaked roof was a sort of a square turret, some 30 feet high and topped by a deck with railings around it. A flagpole stood in one corner, and on Sundays and holidays displayed an American flag with its 51 stars. The upper room of this turret was consecrated to the task of stargazing. There the doctor manned his instruments, and on clear nights he took his binoculars and telescopes out onto the deck, where he could freely inspect the dome of the skies. There, too, despite Mrs. Huddleston's warnings, he came down with the world's juiciest coughs. Daddy will end up infecting the galaxy, Miss Lou rattled on. The whole universe will have runny noses. But the doctor paid no attention and sometimes went out in temperature below 20 degrees Fahrenheit during those major winter freezes when the skies are at their clearest. From the watchtower of his Morris Street home, incidentally, you can easily see the observation deck of the house on Elizabeth Street. No monuments stood in between them. No trees stuck their leafy branches in the way. The two dwellings were half a mile apart. With a respectable pair of binoculars and with no need for long-range telescope, we could readily see people in the opposite tower or deck. Needless to say, Dean Fawcett had other things to do beside gaping at Stanley. Needless to say, Dean Fawcett had other things to do beside gaping at Stanley Huddleston, and Huddleston wasn't about to waste his time gawking back at Fawcett. They'd set their sights much higher, and no concern for earthly things. But it was natural enough that Francis Gordon would look for Jenny Huddleston up in her tower, and with the help of their field glasses they often spoke to each other with their eyes. And what's the matter with that? Of course, it would have been simple enough to run a telephone or telegraph line between the houses. A wire stretching between the turrets of their two lookout posts would have allowed Francis and Jenny to indulge in some delightful communing. And no doubt, Little Miss Lou would have frequently joined in, turning a duet into a trio, but Forsyth and Dr. Huddleston didn't want to be disturbed during their sky watching, had no time for idle chit-chat, and there weren't any plans to install a phone line. But when the lovers were legally wed, wasn't it possible this amenity might be added? After a matrimonial bond, an electric one could bring the two families even closer. That day, Francis was just paying his usual afternoon visit to Mrs. Huddleston's and the daughters. Admittedly, he had the run of the house and he got a warm welcome in the downstairs living room. If it wasn't quite Jenny's husband yet, Lou insisted he was already her brother. And when her teenage mind was made up, that was that. To nobody's surprise, Dr. Huddleston stayed cooped up in his tower. He'd been there since 4 a.m. Like Forsyth, he'd come down late for lunch. Then he dashed furiously back up to his observation deck the instant the sun broke through the noontime clouds. Again, like Forsyth. Obviously, he and his colleague were equally obsessed, and he wasn't likely to come back down very soon. But if he didn't, it would be impossible to decide a certain pressing matter that was the whole point of this gathering. My, Lou exclaimed as young Gordon came through the living room door. Here comes Francis, faithful old Francis. I wonder what he wants. It's like he never leaves. Grinning, Francis first took Jenny's outstretched hand, then greeted Mrs. Huddleston. Afterwards, in response to Lou, he got her to blush by planting a noisy kiss on her cheek. Then the two lovers sat down and started to talk, and they seemed to simply pick up where they had left off the day before. It was as if they'd never been apart, and in their thoughts at least they really hadn't. In fact, Miss Lou maintained that faithful old Francis never actually went away, that he pretended to go out the front door, snuck in again at the back, and hid out the sight in some cubbyhole. That day they talked about what they always talked about while waiting for the union to be finalized. Jenny listened to Francis with a relaxed seriousness that only added to her charm. They looked into each other's eyes and laid plans that they fully expected to carry out in the near future. How could, how could they have known that these plans would be drastically delayed? Hadn't both families consented to their marriage? Besides, Francis had just found a lovely house on Lambert Street that offered all amenities, including a lush, year-round garden. It was on the west side of the town. He had a view over the Potomac and wasn't too far from Mercer Street. Consequently, Mrs. Huddleston promised to go inspect the house the next day, and if the future occupant found it satisfactory, they would lease it in the same week. Lou was to accompany her mother and sister on this tour of inspection. The girl insisted that her advice was essential, that she positively had to be involved in setting up the new household, so they agreed that she could come along and dispense her wisdom. Suddenly Lou got up from her sofa, ran to the window, and exclaimed, "Hey, what about Mr. Forsyth? Isn't he due today?" "Uncle will come by at about 4 o'clock," Francis answered. "If we're going to settle this matter," Mrs. Huddleston commented, "we absolutely need him here." "If he does," Lou intoned, raising a small but threatening fist, "he'll have me to deal with, and his days will be numbered." "What about Dr. Huddleston?" Francis asked. "He needs to be here just as much as my uncle." "Dad's in the tower," Jenny said, "and he'll come when we'll call." "Leave him to me," Lou replied. "He's 3 stories up, but I'll have him down in no time." Both Fawcett and Dr. Huddleston simply had to be present. After all, wasn't it a question of finalizing the date of the ceremony? The wedding was supposed to take place as soon as possible, provided, however, that the maid of honor had time for the manufacture and purchase of an appropriately gorgeous gown. For the first time in her life, Cecily Lou would be wearing a floor-length gown of a young woman. And bearing this in mind, Francis quipped, "So what happens if Notorious gown isn't ready in time?" "I'll demand that the wedding be rescheduled," declared Miss Lou imperially. And this decree was followed by an outburst of giggles that was raucous enough to reach Dr. Huddleston up in his watchtower. Oh, we're past 20 minutes. All right. See you in the next episode.